if you're new to Lovecraft and you decide it's time to start getting into proper horror fiction, you go to a bookshop and you pick a big anthology like this. This one alone is 1,000 pages. And then you also get secondary anthologies which contain all these secondary works, such as his poems and things he co-wrote. So you take one of these home and you open it, and then now what? There's so many stories, where do you start? Lovecraft was a bit of a difficult author, mainly because he had a love of adjectives, he had a love of, well, he had his own writing style for one thing, and he loved to use obscure words which people wouldn't really use when writing. Gibbous, squamous, cyclopean, all these things. If you're starting with Lovecraft, you might not know what these things are. So there are some stories which are easier to get into Lovecraft with than the others, and this is where this video comes in. I chose 5 stories instead of 10 stories because I thought 5 stories would be more focused and it's more specific, and top 10, well, it's still a little bit vague for me. I chose these stories mainly because they each feature a strong theme that we see often in Lovecraft, and also these are very interesting stories, and I think that's most important, because if you start with something boring, you're not going to want to go back and walk for more and more, will you? No. These are also quite easy to read, and I think these are the best. Here we go. The first story I chose is Call of Cthulhu. It had to be Call of Cthulhu because even if you don't know who H.P. Lovecraft is, there's a big chance you know of Cthulhu, or at least have heard of him. Basically the story is about this horrific discovery that the protagonist makes of a cult which worships this ancient being called Cthulhu. And the protagonist then goes off to discover who exactly this thing is and what the cult is all about. Most of the story is told through reports, for example, like police reports, and then the narrative also jumps into reports given by other characters. For example, there's a passage about a police detective and he's arresting cult members, and then there's a passage about the guy's uncle, I think it's his uncle, who actually goes and interacts with this artist who had weird dreams, and then there's a passage from a report about the explorer who actually goes off and discovers Cthulhu and all that sort of thing. I think Call of Cthulhu is a good choice because people are going to be curious, you know. As soon as they discover that H.P. Lovecraft is the creator of Cthulhu, they're going to wonder, well, what's the creature's backstory, you know? We've seen Cthulhu so much now in pop culture. He's being merchandised to hell and back. I mean, there's toys, there's you see him on t-shirts, you see him in board games, you see him in role-playing games. There's a Call of Cthulhu role-playing game that's extremely popular, and that's been going since the 70s, I think. Most recently, he even featured in a South Park episode.
Tom, the DP Oil Company has had another drilling accident. This time, they appeared to have unleashed the dark and mighty Cthulhu. The rise of Cthulhu from another dimension brings about 3,000 years of darkness, Tom.
And also in a few other kids' cartoons, which I never really watched growing up, but now I've kind of watched. The representation of Cthulhu is always quite primitive, and it's always kind of misses the nuances of the character. Rather, it's just about this ancient god that wakes up and decides to kick humanity's ass. That's kind of true, but there's a little bit more to Cthulhu than this base summary of him. What makes Call of Cthulhu so interesting is that it introduces a lot of the tropes which will become common once you start reading more and more of Lovecraft's stories. For example, you have cultists, you have bizarre artifacts turning up, you have people having crazy dreams which, you know, shows them scenes and places which are real, but they are not places for humans to go, that sort of thing. Features forbidden knowledge you should not know, because if you do, you're probably going to go insane or something. It's got people that are affected, they go mad and things like that, and obviously it has Cthulhu in it. You know, one of probably, you know, it is Lovecraft's most greatest monster, I think. The next story I chose is The Shadow over Innsmouth. Now, The Shadow over Innsmouth is about the student who is taking a holiday after his studies, and he decides to do a tour of the New England area, you know, through towns and such. And then through some coincidence or some mishap, he is unable to travel to where he wanted to go, so he gets directed through Innsmouth. And he ends up touring the place, which has some wonderful architecture, but he finds that it's not so easy to leave once he's there. The Shadow over Innsmouth is a great story because it features a lot of mythos in it. You're going to have the appearance of cults again. You're going to have the deep ones, which are characters which feature quite numerous times in Lovecraft stories, and also in stories written by admirers of Lovecraft. The town of Innsmouth is also an interesting creation of Lovecraft, along with Arkham, which is probably his most famous location creation. Say that 3 times fast. The town of Innsmouth is also quite iconic in the Lovecraft universe, along with Kingsport and Arkham. But Innsmouth is very well described in the story, and it is also very atmospheric. You know, he keeps on in the story describing this place, and it builds up a very strong image in your head eventually, and so you can really immerse yourself in this place. It even has a whole book series dedicated just to things that happen in Innsmouth, which are worth checking out from what I've read so far. The pacing of the story itself is quite fluid. Each scene is quite distinct. It's a longer story, so the problem with some longer stories, I think, are that when you're reading them, a scene you've read, you move on to the next scene, the next scene, the next scene, but each scene before is not very distinct in your head. But after you finish reading the story, you will remember each scene quite distinctly, and each scene is played out with the right amount of time. You know, not too much attention or details is spent just describing one place. You know. The third story I'm going to recommend is called The Outsider. It's a shorter story, and it's not one of his most famous, maybe, in that it doesn't feature any of the monsters that Lovecraft is famous for. It doesn't feature any of the themes mainly that he's famous for, like cults or forbidden knowledge, that sort of thing. For that reason, it has more universal appeal. The story basically deals with the theme of being an outsider in society, and I think that's quite a common theme in literature. But Lovecraft does this in a very graphic, and not graphic and violent, but graphic in that the settings and the locations and the events that the protagonist goes through, they're all quite visual, and this is done in quite a concise manner. It's a shorter story, but it is quite a beautiful one, I think. The story is basically set in this gothic castle area with a forest, and it's about this protagonist who's basically alone in this castle, and then one day he is so miserable in this castle that he decides to leave it and venture out into the world to seek light. Be damned if he fails or not. He has to do it because he will die if he just stays in this horrific place. And when I read the story, it reminds me a bit of the visuals from the 1979 Nosferatu film. I even have a graphic novel based on the story, and that's quite a testament to the story, I think, because although it's shorter and everything, like I said, it's a very visual story in the way you can picture the things that happen, and it's also quite beautiful, I think. The fourth story I'm going to recommend is called From Beyond. It's also a shorter story, but it's also one of the more famous stories in the Lovecraft universe. Basically, it's about the scientist who invents this machine, which enables the people who are in the vicinity of this machine to see things that they otherwise could not. So kind of think of like how UV light shows us things that we couldn't see without it. It's like that, but instead of just seeing stains and stuff, you see these horrific creatures and this alternate dimension and things like that. The story features another trope of Lovecraft, which is people going into these realms where they just cannot comprehend anything. Like the geometry is all messed up, the colors are just blurring together to make this kaleidoscopic effect. The person there is experiencing these sounds, not just like sounds, but like things that he feels in his body and head, and it drives him crazy, and the descriptions in these passages are quite beautiful. This sort of idea is best presented in the video game which recently came out called Euclidean, or Euclidean, something like that. You know what I mean. Where the character, it's seen in the first person perspective, and you go through these realms, and it's just crazy, beautiful how everything looks. There are also two films which really present the story from beyond quite well. The first one is a film starring Jeffrey Combs, and it's quite famous. It's called From Beyond. I think that was made around the 90s or 80s or such. But there is a better film made quite recently starring Ron Perlman called The Banshee Chapter. Both films feature the themes of From Beyond quite strongly, but Banshee Chapter really is the film to check out. The fifth and final story that I'm going to recommend is a bit of a wild card. It's called Dreams in the Witch House. Basically, it's about this guy. He's a student of mathematics, and he moves into this apartment in Arkham, the Witch House, which was famous in Arkham at the time. And he has these mad dreams about this witch character and her rat-type creature companion. And it's basically about how mathematics is used to transcend the limits of time and space, but it always has horrific consequences for the protagonist. I said the story is a bit of a wild card, and what I meant by that is that it's quite unusual, and well, not unusual, but it stands out as a Lovecraft story because it features a witch as a main antagonist, and that doesn't really happen at all in his stories. And it also features things relating to magic, and while magic does pop up every now and then, Lovecraft was more of a realist, so he tended to explain his supernatural things away with machines or alien technology, or just, you know, aliens in general, which are more plausible than witches, I'd say. But in the story, magic is replaced with mathematics, which is an interesting twist. One reason for this story being a bit unusual is that it was written after At the Mountains of Madness. It just got rejected, actually. So perhaps Lovecraft was going through a phase of deciding, well, my old writing style didn't quite work, so let me try this. But I think it paid off somewhat. It's a very memorable story, and it's also a little bit more gorier than what he's used to doing. One thing that stood out to me in this story was that it's a bit of a what the fuck story. As I was reading it and rereading it even, as you go through the story, all these bizarre things happen, and you just sort of have to step back and think, what the hell? It also features a theme I previously mentioned from Beyond, a person going into these bizarre realms of color and sound and light and weird geometry and all that sort of stuff. And so once you read a passage like that, you know, it's good to actually just sit back and just try and imagine it in your head, and it's just like, wow, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's actually one of the first stories I actually read about Lovecraft. Before I even knew who he was, I bought this book called Prey a long time ago, and it's basically a fan fiction, albeit a very well-made one, of Dreams of the Witch House. That book is actually quite fun to read if you can get hold of it, although I don't think it's quite that popular. There's also a live adaptation of the film, which is also really worth checking out. It's created by the director Stuart Gordon, who himself, he's a massive Lovecraft fan, and he's directed many live adaptations of Lovecraft. The adaptation is featured in the television series called Masters of Horror, which features basically famous directors of horror films doing these 45-minute long episodes. In general, even if you don't care about Lovecraft, that's really worth checking out. So yeah, basically that's my video. I've got nothing more to say on the subject really. This is just my subjective selection. Took me a while to actually narrow down the list, especially for the last two positions. There's so many other stories you could go for, and of course a lot of it is just personal taste. Yeah, so I look forward to doing some more top 5s later in the future, and thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Cheers.